Welcome to episode 413 of the Reformed Brotherhood. I'm Jesse.
And I'm Tony, and we are proud members of the Society of Reformed Podcasters. Hey, brother.
Hey, brother. We're coming in for a second episode on speaking about the Lord's Supper, and it's going to get a little spicy. We're going to talk about all those things, those little practical things, which of course are theological things that involve the Lord's Supper. Maybe all the things you've wanted to ask, but never said out loud. Or maybe none of the things you want to ask. And this will just be a conversation that you and I have with each other. That's going to be super fun.
Yeah. I'm excited because these are some of the topics that come up. And I think sometimes there's a lot more heat than there is light. And not that we have any great insight to share, but it'll be good to just talk through some of the more controversial questions, fun questions,
sure.
Edgy questions, the sort of nitty gritty stuff that comes up that you probably aren't going to read about too much in a theology book. So I'm stoked.
All the stuff we should be processing, or we recognize that we'll have some differences. So I think we might get to the I word.
Yep.
And we might get to, what about wine versus grape juice? Oh no. So if you're interested in any of that stuff, it's coming up for you in just a second. But speaking of this, I realize, one of the great things about the Lord's Supper, of course, is that we're coming together, the Church Universal, in this to participate in this supper, and food is best consumed together. And so with that in mind, I just came across something just within the last hour before you and I sat down to talk here. And I just have to ask you about this. If I said to you, would you like some hundreds and thousands with that? Would you have any idea what I'm talking about?
I'm assuming it's a food reference because of the way you led into this, but I don't know. I don't know specifically.
Yeah. So I know that we have brothers and sisters listening from all the world, and some of them right now are probably just, again, smashing their devices.
Not that like button. They're not smashing that like button. They're smashing their phones because they're angry.
Yeah. It's just out of sheer wrath or wrath. I'm trying to give you a hint of where this might be coming from. So let me give you a hint of what you might put it on. You could put it on cookies or ice cream.
So is it like a chocolate sauce?
No, yeah. I don't want to say getting close. Again, people are just screaming. I'd never heard of this before. I'd said a couple of weeks ago, this, my wife loves this confectionery thing. She would put it on everything if she could.
Sprinkles?
Yes.
Or Jimmy's?
So apparently the British nomenclature for sprinkles is hundreds and thousands. And of course, not surprising where that number comes from. It's just because they're tiny little confectionery things that usually are many of them. But had you ever heard that? Well, obviously, I guess not. But no. I'd never heard that before.
It's very strange.
It's interesting, right? I talk about something, a name for something being kind of related to what it is, except here you're talking about sheer quantity. And that is such a mouthful to say.
Yeah. Yeah. Talk about two people separated by a common language.
Yeah. That come on, people. Just use sprinkles. I get it. Maybe we're just exchanging quantity for action in describing something, but come on, hundreds and thousands. I literally just watched a television program where this was said over and over and over again. And I was like, wow, it seems like such a waste. Then I had to look it up. And of course, there's hundreds and thousands of biscuits or cakes or on ice cream. And I'm like, my word, what a mouthful that is.
I don't know. British English can be weird sometimes. Maybe it's American English that's weird. I don't know. Maybe that's very, very linguo ethnic centric or whatever, but it just seems like there's a lot of strange circumlocutions and extra words and random inefficient things to say.
All I know is I'm going to be using this all the time because I love some good numerical language, but this just cracked me up. I literally had to stop the program we were watching and say to my wife, what did they just say? And she was all like, yeah, that's what they call it. And I was like, don't give me that's what they call it. You knew what's going on.
That doesn't make any sense.
So that's neither an affirmation or denial, but it is the time where we ask each other, do you have something to affirm with or deny against? And so I said, you, brother, what do you got for us?
Well, I'm going to do a denial, but before I do, I have a quick announcement of sorts. So if you've been listening to the show for any length of time, you may know two things. The first thing is Jesse and I hate subscription model software.
That's true.
I would much rather pay, in most cases, like a lifetime fee and just own the software. Even if it was like more over the course of the time I was using the software than the subscription would have cost me, I probably would rather just purchase the lifetime contract. So that's one thing. The second thing is that we love us some Logos Bible software, and we are
Also true.
We are sponsored sort of by Logos. And this is one of those weird things where like those two facts are true and somehow not inconsistent with each other. But I wanted to make a quick announcement. So Logos Bible software for many years now has been a standard kind of software where you purchase a license and you have a version of the software. And then when the new version comes out, you purchase the new version if you want, or you keep the old version, and sometimes you lose features and sometimes you don't. Logos is moving to an entirely subscription-based model. And I kind of jokingly say, like, we hate subscription models. I did a bit of research and actually think that the subscription model for Logos is actually a reasonable way to do it. One of the main drawbacks that has been universally spoken about with Logos is how like cost prohibitive it can be for many people. Even with all their different packages, it can still be a pretty big chunk of change that you have to put all at one time. So there's two aspects to this announcement that I want to just bring up. I don't actually know, Jesse and I, that the show, we're Logos affiliates. So if you make a purchase on Logos Bible software and use our affiliate code, we get a kickback on that. Usually we take that in the form of credit to enhance our Logos library. I don't actually know what the future of our affiliation looks like and how that works. So the call to action, which usually we're not so good at putting our call to action at the front of the show, which is like, if you follow all the podcasting books, that's where it's supposed to go. The call to action is to seriously consider if Logos Bible software is something that you want to invest in. And if it is something that you want to invest in, I would ask that you go to reformedbrotherhood.com/Logos. And now is a great time because there's a number of reasons why it's a great time. You can purchase Logos 10 and one of their base package libraries of any level, and they're running a pretty deep discount on it. They're calling it a farewell tour. So you can get that software at a discounted rate. And here's the real kicker. If you own a Logos 10 package of any level, you get a discount on your future subscription. I don't know whether that means you need to subscribe right away, or if like just having a Logos 10 license will mean you always get a discounted subscription rate. But at least right now, if you have a Logos 10 a platform or a Logos 10 package, you get a substantial discount on your ongoing subscription. So there's a whole like way that it maps up. More or less, there's 3 different levels of subscription or 4 different levels of subscription. There's 3 different levels basically of the Logos feature set, and like the higher level feature set you have maps up to a higher level subscription. The real benefit of the subscription model is you're getting all of the new features as they come out. And they have what's called a legacy fallback license, I guess, where if you subscribe for 2 full years, continuous years with no gaps, then you lock in the features that you had at the beginning of those 2 years. And then every time new features come out, as long as you've subscribed for 2 years after that feature comes out, you get to keep that. So it actually works out. This is why I say I think it's a good subscription model. It works out very similar to the way Logos works now, where like a feature set comes out, you pay full price for the feature set. And then when the new feature set comes out, you have to pay full price for the feature set. I did the math, and actually like the subscription, if you have Logos 10, the subscription is going to be cheaper than it would be to buy a package. So the cost works out. And unlike most subscription software, you don't lose access to Logos when you stop subscribing. You just lose access to whatever features don't fall within that legacy window. If you purchase a book, just like you do now, you're always going to have access to that book as long as the software exists. You still can purchase books the traditional way like you have been. The subscriptions come with some books. So if you've considered doing this and you're looking for a reason and a time to pull the lever on that, I think you should consider doing it now. And because this is one of the ways that people can support the show, in getting something they may have already been getting, I would really encourage you to think about doing this before this transition happens, which is coming soon. I don't have an exact date. And that's because I don't know if this is a way that you're going to be able to support the show going forward. We haven't affiliates, as far as I've went back through all my emails, affiliates have not received information about what kinds of like subscription bounties or things like that exist in the new model. There very well may be a situation where you can subscribe with our code and then we get like a residual every month kickback or something like that, which would be great. I just don't know the answer to that question. So there's a question mark about our future affiliation and our future sponsorship with Logos, not on our side and not really on their side. I just don't know what the details are. So please do consider purchasing a Logos 10 package if that's something that would be valuable to you. Don't go just do it just because they're expensive and it's not worth doing if you're not going to use it. But if you've been on the fence and you're kind of looking for one more piece of data to help make the decision, this might be it. So just think about it. You can go to reformedbrotherhood.com/Logos. That'll take you to our Logos partner website where it has our affiliate code. There's some deals you can get there, but the biggest deal right now is the Logos 10 farewell tour. So please do check that out. Jesse,
until September 30th, loved ones.
Okay. So you have, by the time this comes out, you'll have like a week roughly to do this. So if that's something you've thought about doing, then please go do it quick. If we have information about new ways to help the show by utilizing Logos software, then we'll bring that to you. But at least for now, I don't know in the future if there is going to be a way to support the show through using or purchasing Logos. So check this out. Jesse, I just talked a lot, so I'm going to defer to you first for whatever your affirmation or denial is.
That's been everybody's PSA. That was our PSA moment. All right. So I'm affirming with our AI overlords. AI has been a topic we just keep coming back to. It's just hard not to, because there is some really decent stuff out there. And I think especially some stuff you can really leverage, use, embrace for the kingdom of God. So here we go, everybody. I've got another great AI affirmation, at least I think. You all can be the judge. It's called Notebook LM. Have you heard of this one?
I have, yeah. I haven't found a good use case for myself yet, but it is pretty cool stuff.
This is so good. So I'm just going to have you search that Notebook, capital L, capital M. And this is a Google product. It is free right now. I can imagine a day when it won't be because of how awesome this is. Yeah. And here's why it is awesome. So it does all the usual stuff you might expect from our AI overloads. First, lords, not loads. First, it allows you to upload a PDF and text files for processing. You can multiple, say you're researching a topic, and it's all the things you would come to expect from AI. Dump in there a bunch of resources in the format of PDF or text files. Then what it does, generates various outputs like FAQs, study guides, briefing documents, all the summarization stuff. But here is the thing that differentiates it, that is absolutely fantastic. And I've been doing this, and I don't want to be hyperbolic, but I'm not sure I can overhype this, how good this feature is. So the most intriguing thing is Notebook LM creates a 10 to 15 minute long podcast style conversation between a man and woman discussing these upload documents if it were like the most fascinating topic they've ever encountered. And not only is like the conversation good, like I'm got context, but like even the banter between them is like, sometimes I find myself chuckling because it's hard to believe that this was generated just out of content, like out of the air from stuff that I uploaded. I find it really interesting to be able to upload like these really long, complicated documents and then hear how these two people basically instruct and teach from that document, including referencing the document itself and particular passages. It is right on. The scariest part of it is this ability to build this podcast style conversation. Exceptional. So I'm affirming with it, go and explore it. Drop in there like a heavy theological treatise. Put something puritanical in that bad boy and let these people talk over about it. It's really interesting to hear that draw together. And it's almost frightening how good it is. Not in the sense like it's threatening, although maybe, again, you might be listening. This podcast might not be me and Tony anymore. All we did was just drop the topic on the Lord's Supper into Notebook LM, and you're just listening to a summarization. But it's really great. It's a new way. You and I have always talked about, like, whether it's like Pocket or something else, the ability to take information that you might otherwise read and to put it into your ears and to have it summarized in different ways, like, so valuable. This is like, for me, take it the next step. I can't believe I hadn't thought about this before, and Google's already on it. So go check out Notebook LM.
It actually creates an audio podcast.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, it creates like it creates like a file, an audio file.
I don't think it was doing that when I first looked at it. So I'll have to go back to it. Yeah. So every new AI gimmick that comes out has its own space that it's in, and Notebook LM is what it sounds like, right? You're creating this notebook of isolated, self-contained data, right? So the idea is like you're dumping all your research into this notebook, and then the AI works within the constraints of that notebook. So it's not going out to the internet to get other stuff. It's got its language model, of course, like it's got all the stuff from its language model, but it's not pulling in information from other resources. And so it's useful for research because it's, where it's getting the data from. With a lot of these other, like Perplexity is great. And actually, I don't use traditional search engines anymore. When I want to find something online, I ask Perplexity a question because it finds it and then it shows me where I got it. But it sometimes will pull information in from a source that it doesn't cite. So Notebook LM is really nice because it's only using the data you give it in terms of raw materials. Like I said, it's trained on a much broader, it's trained on like a huge language model, otherwise it wouldn't work. But it's not utilizing information from that language model in its outputs. It's only using that language model to develop how it responds to you, but not like combining that information. So like if you don't put the Westminster Catechism in there, it knows the Westminster Catechism because I'm sure that was part of its training model, but it's not going to respond to you saying, well, the Westminster Shorter Catechism says blah, 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 where you might get something like that on ChatGPT or Perplexity or one of these other AIs. So yeah, it's a sweet idea. Like I said, I haven't really found a good use case for it for myself, but this might be it because maybe this will put podcasting out of business because you can just dump data into AIs and say, create a podcast, and it'll probably be more interesting and fun than us.
Well, you're kind of right. Like I don't know about the interesting part because this is the definitive podcast on all theological matters. But beyond that, it is nice that it's basically like curating or self-selecting episodes that you want to hear about a topic that you really find interesting in a closed sandbox environment. So you can, again, put all those resources in there and have it. It's more than just summarize it.
Right.
I've been impressed with, and I'm not sure entirely how this works. It was it was teaching on a concept. It was discussing a concept, but using like metaphors to explain that concept that were not in the articles themselves.
Right. That's where the large language model comes in. Right?
Yes, exactly.
It's like if you gave me a document and said, I want you to give a lecture on this, this subject and only use the data from this concept or this document. I probably wouldn't, I'm not just constrained to using the actual words of that document, but I'm not presenting data or like research-based facts out of other sources, even though I might be using metaphors or turns of phrase or stories from outside of that. It's a very similar idea. It's a really cool technology. I mean, the AI, some people say it's scary, and I guess maybe it is a little bit scary. And maybe this is the singularity and I'm here for it, but it's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's still artificial intelligence, of course, by name and by concept. I think what might have great value for everybody here, especially if, let's say, you're trying to understand something, or maybe you're going to teach this same thing. If you were to pull up again something, let's say that you wanted to process a bunch of articles on the active obedience of Christ, I think it'd be interesting to put that all together and see what the conversation results in. That might spur you in your own ability to creatively think through how you might explain that, teach that, come to understand it, apply it in your own life. I think that work could be the great value. It's beyond just summarization. That's kind of a dime a dozen now. It's like table stakes. Like any AI that's worth its salt or artificial salt can, summarize stuff.
Right.
I think it's the ability to respond and to create, to spur creativity in a new and different way. Honestly, this is where like something like Tiago Forte's book, like Developing a Second Brain, and like having this like kind of commonplace book, like where it all comes together, where you're getting like, this is progressive summarization in a new way.
Yeah.
And it's in this audio way where it's creating the ideas conversationally so that people are speaking back and forth about something. And that's honestly difficult to do. I mean, who has not listened to a podcast where you're like, certainly not this podcast, but where you're like, wow, that definitely didn't go well. Or like, the dialogue was kind of like corny or contrived, or like they didn't suit one another. So it's exceptional that can be done in the AI environment now.
Yeah. It's crazy. The real trick is I'm going to put a transcript from our podcast in there and see what it does, how it makes a podcast off a podcast.
It's Inception.
And then I'm going to take the transcript from that. It's going to be, I don't know, I'm going to create some sort of super virus on accident if I do that, but
it's going to be like super Inception, like people talking about.
I'm going to do it. I'm just going to do recursion until it, I don't know, breaks the internet.
It would be super fun to hear though. Like that's the ultimate game of like AI telephone in a way.
See if it gets confused eventually. I mean, this is the fun thing with AIs that are like responsive like that, is to see what actually happens. And like, to be fair, like there's been some freaky, scary stuff that's happened with AIs. Like Google's AI, one time somebody asked how to keep cheese on pizza, or like how to keep the cheese from coming off the pizza. And the answer was like use edible glue. So take everything you get for a grain of salt there, but it'll be cool to see how it does with a podcast transcript.
Yeah, I'm here for it. Let's do it.
I'll upload the file of the audio following this just to see how it goes. It'll come into your feed.
Even better. All right. How about you?
So mine's super, super quick. Everything has a theological underpinning. I don't know that we're going to get into it here. I was at the store. We have this little like deli convenience store at the hospital I work at. And I was there, and I normally get a relatively small selection of 0-calorie sodas. There's your standard Coke Zero, Cherry Coke Zero, Pepsi Zero. Maybe if I'm really feeling out there, I'll get like a Mountain Dew Zero. And I spotted this soda, and I was like, oh, this sounds really interesting. And it was a Oreo Coke Zero.
I've heard of this.
And I cannot deny this harder. I'm one of those people that almost on principle, if I open a soda or a can of beer, or I open, I start eating something that is like a self-contained serving, almost on principle, I will finish it, because my mom, this is going to sound like really weird. My mom used to tell me like, there are starving kids in Asia that would love to have this food. So I just learned to like eat the portion that was put in front of me. And I usually finish what's put in front of me. I took 2 drinks of this soda, and I literally walked to the bathroom and dumped it out and threw it away. I could not get through it. It was the worst. The last time, if anyone who used to be in the pub or is in the pub and has been for a while may remember, not your dad's root beer, or not your father's root beer, or whatever it was. There was this like alcoholic root beer that was just the grossest thing ever. This might be worse than that. So if you're thinking about trying it, just don't. Just take my word for it. It's not worth the $2 whatever it is that you're going to pay for it to try it. It's really quite disgusting.
So this goes both ways. Are you familiar with that? So there's
Coke flavored Oreos now too.
Yes.
See that I was talking to the lady who runs the store, because she asked me about this, because she saw me buy it and she asked me the next day how it was. I said, not so great. You should throw all of it away and ask for your money back. And she said, have you tried the Oreo or the Coke flavored Oreos? I said, for some reason in my mind, that seems like it might go better than the Oreo flavored Coke. And I'm not sure why, and I haven't tried them yet, but it doesn't seem like it's necessarily a 1-to-1 correlation here.
I think if I'm hearing you correctly, it seems easier to go from the Oreo cookie to an Oreo cookie that's Coke flavored, rather than from Coke, the drink, to an Oreo flavored beverage.
Yeah. I think what the lady told me, because she's tried it, she said, if like you remember the old like almost like gummy bear Coca-Cola bottles that you get, like the soda flavored gummy candies that are just like really cola flavored. She said it's kind of like the cream in the Oreo tastes a little bit like that. And I was like, okay, that doesn't sound like something I would love, but it's probably not the worst thing in the world. But the Coke Oreo, like the Coca-Cola with Oreo flavor, first of all, why? I don't understand what the motivation behind that is. It seems like a partnership that both companies are going to regret. But on top of that, it didn't even taste like Oreos. It was like they took artificial chocolate flavoring and just sprayed it into the Coke. It was just really, really disgusting. So I don't know. I haven't tried the Oreos with the Coke flavoring. Maybe that's good. Maybe it's not. I probably will try it if I run into them now, just because I've made such a big deal out of it. But if you're looking at that Coke Oreo on the shelf, whether it's the Zero or the not Zero, just just don't. Or just out of spite and principle, buy it and dump it directly in the drain.
Protest.
Yes, out of protest. Nail the soda to the door of your local Catholic church.
Yeah, so I'm with you. I haven't tried either of those. I've heard better things about the cookie themselves.
Yeah.
And I think the cream in the cookie actually has like Pop Rocks in it. So it's try to simulate even like an effervescence in the cream. Weird. But if the Coke flavor, which is like a legit flavor, like just Coke by itself, like Coca-Cola, a cola flavor, is like, I think like, so there's going to be citrus in that. I assume like lemon or lime. I think cinnamon and vanilla. And then it's like got cola notes. Those things to me seem like they would translate more to like a confectionery, like a cookie, rather than again, like the other way around. You're like that. There's like a bridge one way. There's not, to my mind, not really a bridge the other way.
Yeah.
It's just too weird.
Yeah. It was very strange. And like I said, it's kind of like if I had picked up that drink and didn't know what the gimmick was, there's zero chances I would have identified that it was Oreo cookies. Or like some of those kind of like novelty items where there's like a weird flavor included. You can kind of tell, even if it's not perfect, like you can tell what it is. Not this one. There was no resemblance. It barely tasted like chocolate. It was just really, really awful. And yeah, like I said, I got maybe one or two drinks in before I went and threw it away, and I just couldn't finish it.
Yeah, that's tough. It's a bit like this time of year with all things pumpkin. At least like if you have, I don't know, like pumpkin spice cheese, or if you have pumpkin spice beer, at least there's something like reminiscent, probably just the spicing. But this sounds like if you're saying if I had that, if I blind tasted that, and somebody just handed me and was like, here's a Coke, and you drank that, and you'd be like, your Coke is bad, man. Yeah. What did you do? Like, not that you would be like, wow, this is delicious. Did you put a little Oreos in there? Am I tasting like a little Oreo cream and like that delicious chocolate biscuit? Am I tasting all that? If you can't get there, then it's really probably just gimmicky, and that's too bad.
Yeah. I mean, maybe someone needs to do an experiment. It's not going to be me. It's certainly not going to be me. But maybe someone needs to just grind up some Oreo cookies and put it in a bottle of Coke and then taste it. And then compare it to what the Coke Oreo actually, or the Oreo Coke actually tastes like. Because I guarantee you they're not at all the same. And the other thing, maybe this is just another PSA. This time of year, it's pumpkin spice everything. And the big joke is, well, it doesn't taste like pumpkin. That's because it's not pumpkin everything. It's pumpkin spice
exactly.
everything. Pumpkin spice is a specific thing. So it's not that the stuff in most cases is flavored like pumpkins. It's flavored like pumpkin spice, which is like nutmeg, cloves. There's all sorts of stuff, like the stuff you make a pumpkin pie with. That was just added extra. The AI is not going to know what to do with this. I'm going to just throw random stuff in here to see what Notebook LM does with it. But yeah, it was quite disgusting, and I don't recommend it.
Yeah, we got to test it. But honestly, this is not too far away from at least part of our topic.
Yeah,
this conversation, which is we're talking about the consumption of the Lord's Supper, which has elements. And I guess I'll ask you, where do you want to start? That could be one place we start, but we don't have to.
Well, I think that Jesse is leaning towards the intinction question, where you combine two elements that ought not to be combined.
Yes, there we go.
So Jesse, do you want to intro that topic and maybe talk about what intinction is, and then maybe we can. We actually have done an episode on this in the past, so we probably won't spend a ton of time on this because you can just go back and listen to the intinction episode. I think it might be in the series of episodes where I was trying to be clever when I named it, so it might be called "Sip It, Don't Dip It." Might be called the episode. But yeah, why don't you tell us what intinction is, and then maybe we'll talk about why we don't think it's a great idea and why maybe some people do.
Yeah, I think that's fair. So I just like furiously put this into Notebook LM and just had to try to spit out to me a conversation. And I was listening to it on the side while we were talking. It said, intinction is like the combination of Coke and Oreos in a single drink. Just kidding. I mean, that is kind of the idea, right? So this is not a practice. Probably there are many people that may not know the word. That's why I think it's a fun word, at least to say and to understand. But it's just that merely the act of dipping bread into the wine or the juice of the Lord's Supper. That is like, it's just dipping. There's not much around. And I think, without like regurgitating, rehashing, recapitulating everything that we said before, I think most of the time I see this take place, it's, people are going to really come at me for this, but it's more of a matter of convenience, I would say, in the administration of the elements. I don't often see like a strong theological argument for this. In fact, it's also a little weird. Like, at least in our culture, we don't tend to dip a lot of bread into like straight up liquids. I mean, if you got some sauce or some like oil, that's a different thing. But this combination of taking either like the bread or a wafer and dipping it into the cup and then consuming all of them together. I mean, I'm really trying to stay away from more commentary about this. That's pejorative, that draws in the Coke and the Oreos, because actually I think that is like the perfect example.
Yeah. And I think, I think you're right that this is most often a matter of convenience. When you're trying to administer the sacrament, or if you're a Baptist, the ordinances, and you now have, instead of having to have two processes of whatever process you do, right? Some churches have everybody come forward and they wait in line, they're given the elements there. Some of them, they pass around a plate. Some traditions, you kneel at a rail and it's delivered to, there's lots of different ways that the elements can be distributed. And necessarily with the Lord's Supper, you're doing that twice. And so I think in some instances, the practice of intinction came about because it makes it faster. It's actually more efficient or more effective to do it, which of course we know is not a great theological reason to do something, right? Just because we want to make it faster doesn't mean we should change things. I have heard periodically, I've heard people try to make the argument, and I think this is a very ad hoc or a very post hoc argument. When I say ad hoc, post hoc, basically it's like you make the argument after the fact. So the practice came about, and then there's some effort to justify the practice after the fact. They'll try. I've seen it where people try to justify the practice of intinction theologically by saying like, well, body and blood are not separated from each other, and so we're actually partaking of the whole Christ if we do intinction because we're taking the body and the blood together. And again, like that's just not. That's not a good argument. We talked at length, I think, last week about the fact that the Bible invests specific symbolism into the Lord's Supper, and we didn't really get into it, and we probably aren't. You can go look at 1 Corinthians 10 and 11 is the most explicit chapters and most explicit kind of exposition that's offered in the New Testament about like the meaning of the Lord's Supper and the process of the Lord's Supper. And then, of course, the passage in the Gospels where the actual Last Supper happened is where it's instituted. The Bible knows nothing about trying to reintegrate these elements in order to symbolize taking the whole Christ. So, yes, I guess maybe you could make some sort of efficiency argument that it makes sense to do these together because it allows you to do it faster or something like that. You might be able to make some sort of like public safety argument, although I think intinction is disgusting, and I think that it actually is like way less hygienic than other ways to do the Lord's Supper. But I think like at the end of the day, and this is where Jesse and I landed last time, I doubt very much that Jesse's position has changed, and mine certainly hasn't. At the end of the day, like the Lord instituted a sacrament that has two distinct elements and two distinct applications, right? And each application, each element has its own symbolism as part of the process that then combines together, that sort of like comes together Voltan style, to form the Lord's Supper and all of the signification there. So when we take the Lord's Supper, we're commanded to eat, and as often as we eat, we do this in remembrance of him, and as often as we drink, we do this in remembrance of him. And eating a piece of food that is soaked in a liquid is not the same thing as drinking. So I think there's more that could be said about this, and I think we said more about this in our episode on this. But I think in general, the Reformed consensus is like intinction is not really a biblically justified practice.
No, it's definitely a poor substitute for the proper administration. And just in case anybody thinks like we're harping on this too much, I'm guessing your perspective, we have the same mind on this. We've talked at length about how the Reformers commonly spoke of like three marks of the true church: the gospel is faithfully preached, the sacraments faithfully administered, and church discipline is properly carried out. I don't think anyone would debate the claim that the gospel is at stake here in intinction, nor would I say like anyone would claim that the Lord's Supper becomes null and void to the use of intinction. What is at stake is the clarity of the sign of the Lord's Supper when intinction is evoked. So I think what we have here is Jesus being very clear about like one would ask, why would we do a combination that wasn't administered by Jesus? Why would we, other words, like combine, conflate, try to quicken? There is this slowing down, take and eat, take and drink. And you're right. I think we need to consider those as separate elements that come unified together in the spiritual consumption of these two elements. But even the earliest church was like anti-intinction. Like that is not a like first century invention. And I think what's happened is, like we talked about maybe with some of the other representations or little things that we add to the Lord's Supper, it got grounded in and rooted in tradition. And then that's what carried it forward. So you do tend to find intinction among certain denominations, certain church groups. And interestingly, that's where it's pocketed with, I would say, like some rigidity, which is interesting to me. Yeah. But this is about, again, like this is I would say like the way in which we worship with this, the way in which God prescribes it to us is important. And I think with a lot of the things we're talking about, like a lot of the questions, which we'll move on after I say this, I promise, is that we're going to find if you can get as close to scripture as possible without getting out of hand, that's what you want to do.
Yeah.
That's what would be best. And so here we just take our Lord and Savior at his word. He gives the bread representing his body. He gives the wine representing his blood. And he says, takes each one in turn, just like you would consume any of your other meals. Unless you're the kind of person that's always dipping everything into your milk or into your water.
Yeah.
I mean, again, that only works with Oreos and milk, but that's like a whole nother thing. It's good for cookies, bad for the Lord's Supper.
Yeah, I'm scrambling to find it, but I want to read the Christ's institution of the Lord's Supper. I'll read what Paul has to say about it, because I think this is sort of like the nail in the coffin of intinction, right? So starting in 1 Corinthians 11, verse 23 says, "For I received from the Lord what I also delivered or handed over to you, that the Lord Jesus on the night when he was betrayed took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, 'This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' In the same way also, he took the cup after supper, saying, 'The cup is the new covenant. This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes.'" So on the face of it, intinction is not eating and drinking, right? It's eating, right? When you right. No one would say when you dip an Oreo cookie in a glass of milk that you're drinking milk.
Correct.
Right? That's just not real. And anyone who says, well, yeah, you're drinking milk, and they're just probably just trying to justify intinction. The issue is that the symbolism of the bread and the symbolism of the cup are not the same. They're not the same symbolism, right? So the bread in Paul's articulation here, and this is why I wanted to go back to the actual account in Matthew and Luke, and I think Luke is a more expanded version. I'm just not finding it off the top of my head here. I think Christ actually, he is saying more, he uses more words than what Paul says when he's summarizing.
Right.
And I think that's important. And maybe we'll go back and find it. But the bread sacrifice, or the bread signifies more or less like what happened to Christ's body on the cross. This is why some people want to lean into the language of like the bread broken, the body broken. Jesse is going to throw a conniption fit if I lean too heavily on that symbolism. But that's the symbolism of the bread, right? It's really more about like the bread represents the death and the passion of Christ. That's what's being symbolized in the bread. The cup and what's in the cup, depending on which gospel you're reading, but the cup itself is the covenant. And so we have these two symbols together, and they're dependent on the elements being administered separately. So it's not just like a crass argument that like, well, Christ did it this way on the table. Like Christ had bread and he had wine, and he ate bread and he ate wine, and he did them separately. It's not as simple as saying like, well, this is the way Jesus did it, so this is the way we're going to do it. Jesus didn't hand out little wafers, right? He didn't have little plastic cups full of juice or wine. So we're already not doing things exactly the same way Jesus did. Some churches do a common loaf and a single chalice. Like that's fine. The vehicle that the wine is in, I don't think is all that important. But it's not as simple as saying like, well, Jesus did this in 2 steps, and so we should do this in 2 steps. Jesus did it in 2 steps because each step has a different signification. And for Reformed theology, like we talked about last week, the signification is basically everything, right? We participate in the sign through faith. We get what's actually signified. Right. The signification gets all weird and blurry. And so I think one could ask the question, and I say that in this weird way to like defer it from the fact that I'm actually about to ask the question. One could ask the question, if you have a completely different sign, can you possibly be participating in that which it signifies? And I would argue that intinction represents a totally different sign than what separate bread and separate wine, and we'll say grape juice, and we'll go there next. So I know everybody is screaming, why don't you talk about wine versus grape juice? We'll go there next. But separate bread and separate wine or separate juice signifies something different than combined bread and juice does, or combined bread and wine does. And so I think because significance, and the sign is so central to what we believe is going on in the Lord's Supper, I don't think you can easily just change the sign and not have really significant, pardon the pun, really significant theological consequences. Even if you don't realize what they are.
Right, exactly. That goes back to like the clarity of what we're participating in. The verbs do matter here. If you want intinction, then it's best saved for your Oreos. So I have Luke 22 before me now. Here is the passage where Jesus administers his supper. In the beginning of verse 14, it reads, "When the hour had come, Jesus reclined at the table, and the apostles with him. And he said to them, I have earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I say to you, I shall never again eat it until it is fulfilled in the kingdom of God. And when he had taken a cup and given thanks, he said, take this and share it among yourselves. For I say to you, I will not drink of the fruit of the vine from now on until the kingdom of God comes. And when he had taken some bread and given thanks, he broke it, gave it to them, saying, this is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. And in the same way, he took the cup after they had eaten, saying, this is the cup which is poured out for you in the new covenant in my blood. So I'm with you. The verbs here are very specific. And I think they're specific because it is an administration of eating and drinking. And Christ is clear about this when he speaks about what it means to be in him, to feed on him. It is a feeding and it is a drinking. There's no need to conflate these two. We don't need to be more efficient on this. It is actually, I think, the slowing down and the processing of these dual elements as Christ gave them, because otherwise he would have administered them in a way that said, hey guys, I'm going to pass it around, hold the bread for a second, dip it when the cup comes around, right? Eat it all together. But he doesn't say eat it all together. This is the blood that was poured out on the bread so that you might consume it together. He gives us these separate things. That is absolutely deliberate, right? And intinction just cuts against that.
Yeah. So, and the theological argument, which again I think is an after the fact argument trying to justify a practice that developed with no theological underpinnings. If I'm wrong and someone out there knows of a theologically driven argument for intinction that somehow precedes the practice, then please do bring it my way. I've actually looked for it before. I haven't found it. But the argument that reintegrating the elements somehow is closer to participating in the whole Christ, what that does is it takes all of the signification of the cup and it just eliminates it. So you're basically saying all that signified is the death of Christ, the body that's given for you, but not the covenant making, which is what the cup signifies. So yes and amen. Like there's a way that it was instituted. There's a pattern that we're given, but even deeper than that and more important than that, I almost said more significant. I caught myself there. Even more important than that is that we really kind of like destroy what the signification is and the symbolism is, right, particularly of the cup. And I never really thought about this before, and I was about to just make like a smart comment, but actually it's pretty significant. We're right back to the Middle Ages, right? Where like the people were denied the cup, right? They were only given the bread.
It's a kind of denial.
Right, exactly. So like we're right back to the errors of the Roman Catholic Church in the Middle Ages, where like people were not getting the whole sacrament. They weren't receiving the whole signification of the sacrament because they were never participating in the cup. So anyway, I think we should probably like move on to another spicy topic because we did do a whole episode on this. But I think this is like a really good entry point because it really does like show what we believe about the supper really has some like specific outcomes and specific things that tie into it, that even little modifications of what we're doing and what we're saying and what we're thinking when we do the cup or the bread can have some pretty significant theological like implications.
Yeah, with all this stuff, it's almost worth it to start with like a prescriptive posture, that what's being given us here is actual instruction. And we already railed against some of those things that we all have done at times to add to it. But at the same time, then we shouldn't subtract from it either. Right. And the intinction is, in my mind, a great subtraction. If it isn't actually fencing out the cup explicitly, it is doing that implicitly. And then it's going to conflating these two. And like I said, the power is in the verbs, eating and drinking. And if you follow intinction, you're just doing one. Again, save that for the cookies. So let's get then to the good old question, which everybody always wants to talk about: wine or grape juice? And I don't know, maybe like part B of that question is, was it just grape juice to begin with?
We can start with part B. No, it wasn't just grape juice.
You mean it wasn't Welch's?
No, it wasn't Welch's. No.
Okay.
No. I mean, I think people might actually be surprised at the position that I take on this. Before I say my position, what are you, Jesse? I think I know, but I'm sure the listener is wondering, do you think that we must use wine, or is it acceptable in some sense for us to use non-alcoholic grape juice?
So this is part of a broader family of questions, isn't it? Because like the one that comes off of this is like, well, depending on what we say here, what is to stop us from saying like, what if you don't have access to any of those particular things? Can you use other things? We talk about this. Could you use like a Dorito and Mountain Dew? Right?
Yeah.
That question is probably coming. Like presuming that there's some kind of circumstance that would legitimately dictate that that's all you had on hand, or you were in the proper environment, proper administration. Those are the only elements. So, yeah, you're right on. So my general idea on this is, if we can get as close as possible, that's best.
Yeah.
However, my conviction is that either wine or grape juice is permissible. And I would go even further to say, again, like I tend to have sensitivities to gluten, for instance. So in my church, there's always like a gluten-free option. And some would very much disagree with me and say, well, if it doesn't have gluten, it's not really bread. And I think, again, that might be a bridge too far to cross here. Yeah. So I think what's acceptable and permissible is, what we want to do is get as close as possible. But if there's something that legitimately precludes us from doing that, and there are lots of reasons why wine would not be the best option, then I think that is absolutely permissible. What say you?
Yeah, I think maybe let me come at this from a different direction. I have heard a lot of arguments, a lot of different kinds of arguments that say wine is the only proper element, the only God-ordained or God-authorized way or substance to use for communion. Right. And most of those, and I it's hard to say this without sounding like super snotty and arrogant, most of those actually rest on people not understanding Greek. Right. So people will make many arguments, or also just not having a good like grasp on logical categories. They'll make many arguments about, well, there was no such thing as non-alcoholic wine in the first century, which is true. Right. Right. Although not as true as you might think it is. But yes, the fact is that people didn't have a concept of the difference between wine and non-alcoholic grape juice. But that fact actually undercuts the argument that people are making, right? What they want to say is like, well, the word in Greek means alcoholic wine. But then at the same time, they want to say there was no such thing as non-alcoholic wine. So now they're saying, well, okay, well, would you expect a language that to have a word for non-alcoholic wine when there's no such thing as non-alcoholic wine? So there's a lot of arguments that I think rest on logical fallacies or misunderstandings of the way the Greek works. But theologically, I actually think most of these arguments depend on sort of a more Roman Catholic conception of the nature of the sacrament. Yes. than a Reformed conception. What I mean by that is that for the Roman Catholic, and this, if you're a person who believes wine only, please at least hear me out before you get mad and smash that unlike button. And by the unlike button, I mean your entire phone. The Roman Catholic position is more or less, and again, if there's like the one Roman Catholic listener to this, please, I know that you're probably upset with me about this, but please just have a little bit of grace on me. The Roman Catholic position is that once the element is transubstantiated by the priest, that's an objective fact. So whether it's an unbeliever who is eating the transubstantiated host, or whether it's a believer, or whether it's the mouse who the crumb fell on the floor, all of those parties are ingesting Christ's body in a literal corporeal sense. And so the substance itself, the physical substance itself is central and tantamount and paramount to the sacrament, such that the Roman Catholic Church actually had to have like study committees, or the equivalent of study committees. If they were Presbyterians, they'd be called study committees. I don't know what they call them in Roman Catholic circles, but they had to like do work to figure out whether gluten-free bread could possibly be transubstantiated.
Right.
Their answer was no. Like their answer was no, gluten-free bread is not actually bread, and so it can't be transubstantiated into the body of Christ. And I think Protestants look at that and kind of chuckle at how ridiculous that is. That like we're quibbling over the like ingredients of bread and whether or not a particular kind of bread can possibly be transubstantiated by a priest. Like we look at that and immediately think, well, that's silly. Yet we don't think it's silly when we look at the ingredients of wine, alcohol being one of them, and say, well, this can't be the element, and this can be because of the ingredients. And I think because of what we said, or what I've said, Jesse hasn't said it, but I don't think he disagrees. What we've said about this, the fact that like signification and symbolism, what the sign is, being central to what Reformed theology thinks about the sacraments, then it is really about what is more or less fitting of a sign.
Yes,
and yes,
exactly.
Some things can be so unfitting as a sign that they don't properly signify. They can't properly signify something. So like all you people out there that are like, well, could we use Doritos and Mountain Dew? No, we couldn't use Doritos and Mountain Dew because the properness, the fittingness of the sign is not appropriate for those things. Right. But could we use gluten-free bread? Well, yes, it's bread. We acknowledge it's bread. In our culture, we consider it bread. We think of it as bread. There's nothing distinct that makes it not bread in the minds of most people. And I think that wine versus grape juice is probably in a similar vein in that, like, for most of us, what is fitting about it is that it is the fruit of the vine, right? That's one of the phrases Christ used. So like, could we use like apple wine? I don't know about that. Like that's not the fruit of the vine. Apples don't grow on vines. But I'd be open to an argument otherwise. So I think, I think like alcohol, non-alcohol is almost like a question that misses the point.
I totally agree.
Yeah. So what do you think? I mean, I know you said you
so,
totally agree, but I'd like you to say more about that.
No. And I guess I want to add and throw back at you. I think that might be interesting for us to chat about. So I think you're right. This comes back to like the center of what we're talking about here. So when Jesus speaks the bread as his body and the wine as his blood, we can take him at his word without resorting to confusing the sign, the bread and the wine, and the things signified Christ's body and blood. I'm sure we probably talked that to death already. But, and like we said last time, that means as well, we should insert words like this represents my body, as in the case of those who believe that the Lord's Supper is essentially a memorial meal and that nothing is received through partaking of the bread and the wine. You know, Paul calls Christ the rock in 1 Corinthians 10. So too, the bread is Jesus' body, but not because the sign is miraculously changed into the thing signified.
Right.
That's again, like the Roman Catholic era you were just talking about in transubstantiation. But rather it's because Christ can speak of the bread, the sign, as though it were the thing signified, his body, using the language of sacraments. So because a true sacramental union exists between the sign and the thing signified, the bread can indeed be spoken of as Christ's body, as Jesus does when instituting the sacrament itself. What that means, I believe, as I've understood it, is everything you just said. Like when we get close to that representation, we're on the mark, and there may be good reason for us to deviate from that. What I think might be even more interesting is because you're right. Like this, I think it's like a red herring. It's kind of like just a distraction to like get really fired up over whether it's like, you know, grape juice or wine. What is the thing? What I find more interesting is like we say, I come across this with some regularity. Let's say that there's somebody ministering in a foreign part of the world or a really remote part of the world where those two things don't really even exist. Is it appropriate where there is the church present? And I just talked about like the three things that establish the true church: the gospel being preached, the sacrament being administered properly, and church discipline being properly applied. Like, is it suitable there to deviate based on everything that we just said about the fact that we can take Jesus at his word
Yeah.
confusing the sign and the thing signified.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, I've thought a little bit about this, and I think this is where it becomes important to understand the cultural rootedness or like the cultural situatedness of the Gospels, right? So Christ came to a specific point in time in history, to a specific people. And a large part of that, of course, is that this is the Jewish people.
Yes.
But also, like, this is the 1st century. Christ could have come to the Jewish people in the 5th century BC, or he could have come in the 3rd century AD, or he could have come in the 21st century AD, right? And so I think when I hear bread and wine, what I think we should be understanding on the broadest scope is not like this particular kind of baked good with a particular set of ingredients, right? Leavened, unleavened, is it grain? Is it some sort of other flour? Like, all of those questions are interesting to talk about. But at the end of the day, I don't think that's the central question mark that we have. And so also, grapes versus, like apples. Well, I know I just said, like, I don't know, apple wine, maybe not. But I think that's because in the culture we live in, we have grapes. We have other things that grow on vines, right? I think if you were, and I think I balk a little bit at this question, just to be really honest, and this shows you that Jesse and I don't talk about these things before the episodes. I think the question itself might be a little bit of a category area, at least in our modern culture, right? I remember talking to a friend who works for Bible translation. He works for a Bible translator organization. And he talked about how there was a live discussion within his organization. They were in a culture that didn't have sheep, right? And so they were trying to figure out, how do we translate the phrase that Jesus is the Lamb of God? Because they don't have lambs, they don't have sheep. And the closest thing to sheep that they had in that culture were pigs. And so there was a live discussion about whether or not it was acceptable to translate the phrase Lamb of God basically as swine of God. And I think the conclusion was no, and it had to do with like all of the baggage that the Old Testament has with pigs and swine and like the uncleanliness laws. But I think it's a similar question here. In a culture where bread genuinely doesn't exist, I think we would default to whatever kind of equivalent staple food it is.
Exactly.
And that's because in the Jewish culture, in most cultures, and this is why I balk at the question a little bit, I don't actually know of a culture that doesn't have some sort of grain-based baked good. I don't know of one. This is like the eternal question, like, is a hot dog a sandwich or is a taco a sandwich? It's kind of that same question. Like, is a tortilla actually bread? Because it's in many, like, flour tortillas are like wheat that's beaten into a flat like purpose and like it's baked. I think we would say, like, whatever the staple food that's equivalent to bread is, that's what we should use for communion. Okay. And likewise, like, I guess a culture that doesn't have any sort of wine, but has some sort of like fruit-based alcohol drink, which I'm sure every culture does, we would use whatever fruit-based alcohol drink they have, even if it's not wine proper. I don't even know what the definition of wine is, to be honest with you, but whatever that definition is, I could conceive of a culture that doesn't have that, but they've got something similar that's close enough. And this is where I think the signification matters. The wine isn't, it's not the fact that it's wine that it's important. And actually, if you read the Gospels, the wine is not what's signified. It's the cup. In most cases, the cup is what is the new covenant in his blood. And we can't get into all that. That'd be an interesting question for a different episode, I guess. But like, we often think of the wine as that which is central to the signification. But the cup is actually what's cut off. This is the cup. This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Not necessarily like, I don't think, maybe I'm wrong. I don't think any of the Gospels say this wine is the covenant in my blood. It's the cup that is poured out that is the covenant in his blood.
Exactly.
So I think we have to default to, like, in a culture that truly has no corresponding element, no corresponding item, I think we would have to default to like whatever is the closest kind of analog. But I also don't think that most cultures don't have a pretty much one-to-one correlation with something.
I think many have something close. Like you said, I think the best answer is whatever is close enough, whatever is representative of that thing which Jesus was doing in the scandal particularity by being present in that culture in the time partaking in the Jewish Passover.
Right.
And so I'm totally with you on that. I think that the reason why I bring that up, though, is because you can see how some would go from, you can start slightly off center there with your question. Say, well, if you say things like, well, if it doesn't have gluten, it's not bread. That we're talking about the molecular composition of the bread. So then you go to Africa, Asia, and you'll find some grain-based baked good, but it might not have gluten, or it might be totally different, or it's not going to use the same grains that we're talking about here. And in point of fact, probably most bread that people are eating in like the US is not like Jewish style bread anyway. Like you can make that argument, right? So like we've already pulled away from, and yet we willingly go in and understand, well, this is close to, it is a staple that nourishes, that is baked in a loaf, right? And so that is the thing that holds together. And I think the same is true with both those elements. But I'm with you. I think it is appropriate to find whatever that cultural analog is, especially when maybe there isn't a really close analog. And I think there are parts of the world that's got to be true. I mean, there's where people just eating into very different things, though they might be related because they're grain-based or they're fermented, but that's, wine is fermented grape juice. And we happen to live in a place where grapes can be grown in lots of parts of the world. But I don't think, like, if I couldn't import grape juice, I'm not sure I'd get a lot of grape juice where I live, to be honest with you. Like, it doesn't exist. So there's all these things that draw us back to, I think, what you were encouraging, which is like the central purpose. What is the center of gravity of the Lord's Supper? And understanding the cup, I think, is particularly important to that, because there's more debates, I think, in my mind about the cup than there are about what's in the cup than there are maybe about the bread. And so I think these things are just worth talking about, because we have to be really careful about what is being signified here. That is super important to get clarity on that, to draw in and lean into those things and to process them together. And this is part of all of that process, is really making sure that we have a prescriptive understanding of what God has given us to do and participate in worship through the Lord's Supper. Yeah.
Yeah. This is the last thing I'll say on it before we wrap up, is that last point you made there actually is that the debate is largely around, I don't often hear people debating whether or not we have to use unleavened bread, right? I hear people debating a lot of times whether we have to use alcoholic wine. Yes. And what that tells me, and I don't want to impute motives to people, but I think I've been in this conversation long enough. It tends to happen among a particular demographic of young, reform, restless people who just discovered that it's okay to drink beer. Like this is where the conversation, in my experience, really became a flashpoint, is in the reform pub. And I'm not in the reform pub anymore. I don't know if they still have this argument once a month or not. But it felt like every new guy, every young buck who came in and realized, like, I can drink beer, suddenly came into the argument that, like, only wine is acceptable. And you never heard people arguing about, well, only unleavened bread is acceptable. Right. And so there's just an inconsistency in that argument, that on one hand, wine means wine. Well, people would say, like, well, the substance, the liquid that was in Jesus's cup had alcohol in it, therefore ours should have alcohol. And I would often say, well, the substance that was on Jesus's table didn't have leaven in it, didn't have yeast, and so ours should not. And they're like, well, that's different. Right. Well, how is it different? And the real answer is, like, both of those arguments are totally missing the point, right? The argument is not about the physical substance. The argument is about, does what I'm partaking of, the physical element that I'm utilizing for this, does it have a proper fittingness to be able to signify what it is that I'm doing, right? And I think for the bread, some of the significance, some of the fittingness is this a staple item? Is this what the average everyday person eats to sustain their life? For most people in the United States, most meals have some form of bread with it, right? When you eat breakfast, you have toast. When you have lunch, you might have a sandwich that has bread on it. At dinner, you might have a dinner roll. Like, that's just part of the meal, is this bread substance. Every culture has that staple substance that's part of their meal. That is what it is. And it's because Christ is the staple substance of our spiritual life. He's the nutrients we get no matter what, at every meal, at every single thing. He's what it is. His body is what feeds us all along, every time. Likewise, the wine has a different significance. We don't have time to get into it right now. But something like Mountain Dew doesn't signify what wine is, right? It's not it's not the same thing. And so like the youth pastor who thinks they're clever and says, we're going to do, and I've never actually been in a situation that does this. I don't know. I know a lot of youth ministers, and I've never met anyone that has actually tried to do communion with Doritos and Mountain Dew. So it may just be a big red herring anyways. But the clever youth pastor was like, we're going to do communion with Doritos and Mountain Dew because that's what we have. Okay. Like you couldn't like take 5 minutes and run to the store. Like,
right.
Like Doritos are not bread. Grape, Mountain Dew is not wine or grape juice. Like it's very different things. And again, I don't actually know a youth pastor. I've never actually heard of a youth pastor actually doing that. I think that's one of those like scenarios that gets passed around like real, but it's actually not. So I don't think we're going to come back next week and do this. Maybe we will. We never know. It's always a roulette wheel whether or not we're going to continue on a subject or not. But I hope that we've had a chance to sort of talk about at least two of these sort of like spicier elements here. And I think the underscoring point that I want to make, and we'll come back to the theology of it when we get to this in the Scots Confession, is really the Reformed understanding of the Lord's Supper has to do with the signification of things. And that's where both of these come in, right? Intinction does not signify the proper things that are needed to be signified. And Doritos and Mountain Dew don't signify the things that need to be signified. And yes, you can make arguments that maybe Welch's grape juice doesn't either. And we can talk about that. But I think that's where we need to land, is like we need to think about the fittingness of the symbols that we're using, the fittingness of the elements that we're utilizing. And we need to think about like, what is it that God is doing in this supper? What is he trying to signify, and how do we participate in those in faith? That's really where it comes down. I
totally agree. I have this theory that when we talk about those two things, like what we gravitate towards in terms of like our own, I don't want to say convictions, but our proclivities or interests in which elements are most appropriate in the West, because that's my own culture. That's all I could speak of. Here's my theory about it. When it comes to the cup, it's like our culture generally does accept wine. It accepts wine for consumption without abuse generally. And it often accepts it as a celebration drink, something for special occasions. So I think we gravitate to that and say, yeah, I can get behind that. And of course, Jesus was literally drinking wine. So we're like, okay, yes, let's just do that thing. And I can get behind that. Here's my theory with the unleavened bread. I mean, in our culture, if you look at unleavened bread, you're probably going to be like, what happened to that bread? Why does it look so weird? Like, why did it come out bad? What did you do? It didn't work, did it? What cracks me up is if you look at almost like any, especially in the West, like any visual representation of the elements, is it not always a giant loaf that's like risen? Like it's just, it's like in the West, that's like a satisfactory piece of bread. It's like, I want to go to the bakery, like cut me off this giant piece of bread that's like steaming hot. Like that's so delicious.
It's like a giant peasant
funny
loaf.
To me.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's just funny to me. It's like, that's what we go with. So you're totally right. It was clear that it was unleavened bread because of the Passover. And yet for most of us in the West, we just find if you're going to give them the choice between like, here's some leavened bread, look at the rise on this bed, look at the air pockets, look at how delicious and soft it is on inside. And then like, here's some leavened bread and be like, look at how flat it is. Look at how crispy it is. Like, you're going to be like, yeah, I want to slap some butter. I just want to get in there and rip apart that loaf of bread and put some butter on. So I think we just have to be honest about this stuff. Yeah. Everything you said is absolutely true. In fact, I would say like on this episode, we've learned that we need to pay attention to the signification here and how close the things are that we're using in the Lord's Supper marry up with that signification, because that is the most important thing. We've also learned that you should save your intinction for cookies and milk. That's a great place to do both of that, because there's no conscription there to both eat the Oreo and drink the milk. If you want to have them both together. And that is often delicious. You should do that. But there's one last thing that we learned, and that is that some things should always be separated. There should always be a crowbar between them. For instance, your Coke and the Oreo, just keep them away from each other. It sounds like we don't even need to go there.
Jesse, I don't even know how to follow that up. That was amazing. I feel like this should be the last episode because it's got to be all, did we just jump the shark?
We did.
Yeah, we totally did. So please don't unsubscribe to our show, even though it's only going to go downhill from that amazing summary section there. I think maybe that Notebook LM actually wrote that "What did we learn?" section. That's got to be the answer, because it was phenomenal.
It did. Really, but if for some reason you're not done, you want to hear more, you want to talk more, here's what you should do. Join us. Seriously, come hang out. Like, come hang out virtually. And you can do that through this Telegram app, which is a messaging app. But we have a little corner, closed off little section of the world where there are people in this little group that are listening to these conversations and want to talk themselves, raise their own voices. And you can do that. And we encourage you to do that. And if you want to find that corner of the internet, here's all you have to do. Go to t.me/Reformed Brotherhood. That link will shoot you across the interwebs into this group so you can see and continue the conversation that hopefully will happen. I'm looking forward to this week because I'm hoping that people will have some things to say in response to everything that we've talked about.
For sure. Jesse, there's all sorts of other stuff we could say and all sorts of other calls to action we could issue, but we're already well past our time. So I'm just going to say this last thing. Jesse, until next time, honor everyone.
Love the brotherhood.
What if I'm far from home? Oh, brother, I would hear you call. What if I lose it all? Oh, sister, I would help.